My name is Margaret Holloway. I am 68 years old, a retired nurse, and a widow for nearly 2 decades. For most of my life, I served others, patients, my husband William, and my only son Daniel. People often told me I was the backbone of my family. The truth is, a backbone can carry weight until it cracks. No one notices until it is too late. On my 68th birthday, I sat alone in my small house at the edge of town. The kitchen smelled faintly of the lavender polish I used on the old table. A single cupcake with one candle waited in front of me. I whispered my wish, the way a child does, though I knew no one was listening. My wish was simple: to feel remembered. That afternoon, a box arrived on my doorstep. Brown paper, taped carefully, and on the corner I saw the handwriting I knew better than my own. My son's. I had not seen Daniel in many months. My hands trembled as I carried the package inside. For a moment, I let myself believe that maybe, finally, he still thought of me with kindness. I tore the paper gently, not wanting to ruin the handwriting. Inside, cushioned with tissue paper, was a tall glass bottle. Amber liquid glowed inside like captured fire. A bottle of whiskey. Not just any whiskey. The label read that it was rare, expensive, the kind men order to impress others. I froze. Daniel knew I had not touched alcohol since William died. My husband's heart gave out one winter evening, after years of heavy drinking. That night, the doctor told me that if I wanted to live long enough to meet my grandchildren, I should never drink again. My son was standing right there. He heard every word. Yet, here it was. Whiskey. A gift, or perhaps something else. I could not bring myself to open it. I placed the bottle on the table beside my chipped teacup, the same teacup I had used every night for years. My tea had carried me through loneliness. Whiskey had taken my husband away. The next morning, I decided the bottle should not stay with me. Robert Hayes, Daniel's father-in-law, had always been kind. He fixed my porch light without being asked. He shoveled my driveway after the last big storm. And he loved whiskey. I thought perhaps he would treasure the gift more than I could. So I carried the bottle across town and placed it in his hands. He smiled warmly and said, "This is too much, Margaret." I answered, "Not at all. You will enjoy it more than I ever could." That evening, the phone rang. Daniel's name lit up the screen. My heart leapt the way it always does when children remember their mothers. I pressed the receiver to my ear. His voice was cheerful, almost rehearsed. "Happy birthday, Mom. Did you enjoy the whiskey?" I hesitated only a second before telling the truth. "Oh, I gave it to your father-in-law. He adores it." Silence. Not static, not distance, but a silence so thick I could hear my own pulse. Then came his voice, sharp and furious, cutting through the quiet. "You did what?" I held the phone tighter. He was no longer smiling. He was shouting. He accused me of betrayal. He told me I had made him look foolish in front of Jessica's family, that I had embarrassed him by giving away what was meant to prove his success, his class, his taste. I sat in my kitchen, the chipped teacup still warm in my other hand, listening as my son raged against me. He was not angry because I refused whiskey. He was angry because I refused to play the role he had written for me. The grateful mother, silent, obedient, displaying his gift like a trophy. In that moment, my stomach turned cold. For years, I believed absence was the worst pain. But absence, I realized, is gentler than the presence of someone who remembers your wounds and presses against them anyway. I listened until his anger burned out and the line went dead. Then I set the phone down carefully and whispered to myself, I did not realize then. The bottle was not a gift. It was a weapon. The line went dead, and the kitchen settled into the careful quiet that follows a slammed door. I stayed at the table where the bottle had rested. The lavender polish was a trace beneath the steam of my tea. Birthdays used to be loud. William teased the match until the candle surrendered. Daniel licked frosting and swore he had not. Now my house made softer sounds, the tick of the clock and the hum of the refrigerator. I had planned nothing grand. A single cupcake from the bakery on 3rd Street. 2 cards in the mail, one from the church circle, one from the pharmacy about a refill. By afternoon, sunlight slipped across the linoleum in long stripes. 3 polite taps sounded at the door. The box was not heavy, yet it carried weight in other ways. Brown paper, careful tape, my son's handwriting in firm strokes across the corner. I ran my thumb over the letters as if touch could translate meaning. Daniel. Inside was a bottle that seemed to bring its own light. The glass caught the window and tossed it back in warm gold. The wax seal had neat ridges. The label whispered of age and rarity. I set it beside my chipped teacup. Tea on one side, whiskey on the other, past and present studying each other across a low fence. I am not a drinker. Not anymore. After William died, alcohol became a closed door. I kept my keys on the hook and my promises on the shelf. Daniel knew this. He sat beside me when the doctor said my heart needed quiet years. So I asked the question that made sense. What was this gift meant to say? That I should pretend the past never harmed us. That I should dress grief in a pretty bottle and call it celebration. Or that my son had found a way to think of me without really seeing me. I could not answer, but I could choose. Robert Hayes loved a good pour and had a good heart. He showed up with a ladder before you asked and left before you could make a fuss. He would honor the bottle, not perform it. So I walked it across town and placed it in his hands. He thanked me with simple words and a steady hand. Generosity is not betrayal. Giving a gift another life is still respect. Morning brought the ring of the phone and Daniel's cheer that did not quite carry music. When I told him where the whiskey had gone, silence poured into the line. After it came heat. You did what? His fury arrived fully dressed, accusations about image and class and Jessica's family. He spoke as if I had stolen a medal from his chest. I kept my voice level. I do not drink. Robert does. It seemed kind. He heard only insult. When the call ended, doubt slid under the door like a draft. I replayed the day, the careful tape, the glowing glass, the small bloom of hope at his handwriting. If the gift were truly for me, why was my choice an offense? If love were the intent, why did respect feel missing from the package? A question I had long avoided took the empty chair across from me. Was the bottle a bridge or a test? Was I meant to accept the symbol rather than the care, to display generosity without my own agency? I made another cup of tea and let the string hang over the rim like a white flag. The teacup is plain porcelain with a hairline crack near the handle. I keep it because it survived what the finer ones did not. What survives is what I honor. The whiskey did not belong to my living, not to my lungs, not to my sleep, not to the memory of a man I loved who lost his fight with it. By noon, the house had gone bright and then quiet. I put the 2 cards in a drawer with rubber bands and spare stamps. I wrote Daniel's name on an envelope and did not put anything inside. Some letters are better unwritten. I wiped the ring of tea from the table and felt the first small steadiness of a woman who will not be examined like a patient anymore. A gift should ease the hand that receives it. If it tightens the grip, it is a test. Today, I still remember the dinners. They were supposed to be family gatherings, warm moments to bridge the years between me and my son's new life. But in truth, they felt more like auditions. Every time I sat at their polished mahogany dining table, I felt as if Jessica, the woman my son chose as his wife, was watching me with a pair of eyes trained to find fault. Jessica was always elegant, always sharp. The way she held her wine glass looked like a silent performance of class. She had a way of looking at me that wasn't exactly hostile, but carried a quiet disdain, a suggestion that I didn't quite belong in her world. It was as though every move I made, every word I said, was underlined in red ink for her private amusement. "Do you enjoy this Pinot, Margaret?" she once asked, her tone dripping with politeness that concealed a jab. "I find it pairs beautifully with duck, though some people struggle to appreciate the complexity." Her words floated lightly, but the undertone was sharp. I smiled faintly, nodding, trying not to betray that her comment stung. The others at the table, my son included, just carried on, laughing at some side conversation, oblivious to the tightening knot in my chest. It wasn't the wine or the food that unsettled me. It was the invisible wall Jessica was constructing between me and my son, brick by brick, every dinner, every subtle remark about taste and class. There was one evening I can't erase from memory. Jessica had ordered a particular bottle of wine, something French and expensive. The waiter presented it as though unveiling a crown jewel. I was nervous already, surrounded by crystal glasses and silver cutlery polished until they blinded me. When the waiter poured the wine, Jessica lifted her glass delicately and announced, "Ah, my favorite Bordeaux." I wanted to join the conversation, to show interest, to belong. So I smiled and said, "Yes, this Chardonnay has such a lovely color." Silence. For one sharp, cutting moment, there was silence. Then it came. The laughter. It wasn't cruel in volume, but it was cruel in effect. My son chuckled. Jessica pressed her lips to hide a smirk, and even one of their friends joined in. "Oh, Margaret," Jessica said sweetly, "Chardonnay is white. This is Bordeaux." My cheeks burned. My hands fumbled with the napkin in my lap, but what I really clung to was the small, worn handkerchief I kept tucked inside my purse. It was Bill's, my late husband's. A simple square of fabric, soft with years of use, faintly smelling of the cedar drawer where I had kept his things. Every time the sting of humiliation pressed against my chest, I would slip my hand into my purse and hold that handkerchief, as if Bill were right there, steadying me with his quiet strength. I tried to laugh along, to brush off my mistake, but the shame lingered long after the plates had been cleared. Jessica leaned across the table later, her voice low, almost friendly, and said, "Don't worry, Margaret. Not everyone grows up around these things. You'll catch up." Catch up. As if I were perpetually behind. A student in a class I hadn't chosen, failing a test I never signed up for. The dinners continued, each one a rehearsal of the same play. Jessica would sprinkle in her comments. "Do you know this brand of china?" Or, "We've been thinking about joining the yacht club. It really elevates one's social circle." My son rarely corrected her. Instead, he smiled, proud of the life he thought he had built, blind to the way it slowly excluded me. I sat there, keeping my back straight, holding on to Bill's handkerchief under the table, rubbing the worn edge with my thumb. That piece of fabric became more than cloth. It became an anchor, a reminder of who I was before Jessica's world redefined me. Bill had loved me in my simplest dresses, had adored me when our dinners were bowls of stew on chipped plates. He had never once laughed at my mistakes, never once measured my worth by the price of wine or the cut of silverware. Those dinners drained me, left me hollow on the drive home. I would turn the key to my modest house, step into the quiet, and let out the breath I had been holding all evening. The silence of my own home was gentler than the clinking glasses and sharp laughter at their table. I would take out the handkerchief, unfold it, and lay it across my palm, whispering to Bill's memory, "I did my best." You'd be proud I didn't cry. And yet, beneath the surface, a question grew like a shadow. How long could I endure being treated as an outsider in my own son's life? Those tense dinners did not end when I left the table. They followed me home like a draft under the door. Before Jessica taught taste and class, William taught another language. He called whiskey a gentleman's hour. One finger after a shift, never more. When Daniel was little, William set him on his knee and spoke about responsibility. He said a man is built by what he refuses as much as by what he takes. I still hear the soft sigh of a cork. On anniversaries, he poured 2 small glasses and told the story of us. Life shifted the way rivers do, slow until it is sudden. Layoffs hit, overtime vanished, and a second job brought nights that stretched. I watched the gentleman's hour become 2, then 3. William still loved me. He still tried. His heart forgave beyond reason until winter said no. After the funeral, I packed his clothes with both hands, shaking, and kept odd things. The belt molded to his waist, the watch with a scratch across the 9, and 3 empty bottles he had saved for their labels, each from a year he was proud of. I lined them on the garage shelf. Dust settled like quiet snow. People call it foolish. I call it evidence that love warmed this house. Daniel did not keep objects. He kept judgments. As a teenager, he hated the smell of whiskey in the house. He wrinkled his nose and asked to eat in the living room, away from the table and its ghost. He loved his father and distrusted the amber. He promised he would never let a bottle decide who he was. I believed him. After he met Jessica, I watched that promise bend. At first it was small, a limited release at a work dinner, a gift bottle for a client. Then came the bragging. Notes about smoke and peat, photos of decanters on a bar cart, captions about heritage and taste. Daniel had not become his father. He had become a man who used the bottle like a citation. In Jessica's world, the correct label opened doors. I try not to make villains out of the living. Jessica grew up where napkins matched the season, and the china had a name. Appearances were currency. She learned that class could guard you from certain fears. Bills that would not balance. Cars that coughed in winter. The heat of being found wanting. She carried that lesson into marriage and into every table where I wrapped Bill's handkerchief around my fingers. She did not set out to be cruel. She set out to be safe. Safety that depends on display is dangerous. You begin to treat people like mirrors. You tilt them until they reflect what you need, and break the ones that do not. When Jessica spoke about taste, she was speaking about fear. Daniel listened, eager to belong. He confused polish with peace. Daniel is my son, not a stranger. When he talks about whiskey now, I hear more than tasting notes. I hear the boy who wanted distance from the worst nights and found a way to dress that distance in crystal. He thinks the right bottle proves he climbed out. He does not see that proof is not a liquid. I would have been proud if he had brought bread and silence. The contradiction cut me where I could not show the bruise. The teenager who begged for open windows became a man who sent articles about connoisseurship. He wanted my applause when a distributor learned his name. I wanted his voice when my roof leaked and the ladder felt too heavy. He measured achievement in labels and invitations. I measured it in kindness without a witness. Sometimes I stand in the garage and trace the raised letters on those old labels. I remember the man who kept his promises as long as he could, and the woman who kept the house steady. I say William's name so it does not flatten into a photograph. I dust the bottles and tell them they are mile markers, proof that we traveled together and that I survived the curve where he could not. After Daniel shouted about the whiskey I gave to Robert, I caught my reflection in the garage window, a woman with flour on her sleeve and resolve in her mouth. I thought of those tense dinners and the night I called Bordeaux a Chardonnay. How small I had allowed myself to become. Standing there, I slipped Bill's handkerchief into my pocket and chose a different posture. Next time someone used a bottle to measure my worth, I would answer with my life. If I stayed silent, they would keep trampling on me. If I spoke, they would call me bitter. What was left of me then? That thought kept circling in my mind like a restless bird banging against the windows of my chest. Silence had always been my shield, my survival tool, in a family where my voice seemed to echo into a void. But shields, when held too long, turn into cages. And I wondered, staring at the muted phone screen on my lap, whether I had caged myself out of my own life. The living room smelled faintly of lemon polish and the roses I had cut that morning. Outside, the sun was folding itself into the horizon, painting the window with a tired orange. My house felt too neat, too quiet, like a stage after the actors had left. And in that silence, the war inside me raged louder than any words I had ever spoken. Then the phone buzzed. A single vibration, but sharp enough to break the fragile calm. It was a message from my son. "Mom, I lost face with him. Dad-in-law thinks I gave him a fake gift. Do you know how humiliating that is? You should have told me if something was wrong." I read it once, twice. My eyes stung as though the letters themselves had claws. The words weren't just an accusation. They were a verdict. Not gratitude, not even curiosity, but blame. It was as if my role in his life had been reduced to a scapegoat, a convenient target for every disappointment that might touch him. The irony was bitter. I had spent decades teaching him to check the small print, to stand upright in a world that would always look down on people like us. I had paid bills with coins, bought textbooks secondhand, stretched casseroles across 3 days so he could have shoes without holes. And yet, here we were. His pride stung, his father-in-law's judgment bruised, and his first instinct was not to stand beside me, but to push me down further so he could stay upright. My hands trembled slightly as I set the phone on the table. The screen lit up with his words again, as if to remind me, "You are the problem. You are the shame." A laugh almost escaped me, quiet, breathless, the kind that hides behind clenched teeth. Was this how motherhood ended? Not with thanks, not even with memory, but with suspicion, with scorn? The weight of it pressed against my chest. Inside, a voice screamed, "Defend yourself. Tell him it was his wife's scheme. Tell him you never touched that gift after the moment you placed it in her hands. Tell him the truth before it drowns you." But another voice, softer, steadier, replied, If you defend yourself, will it matter? If he cannot see you by now, will one explanation clear the fog? My thumb hovered over the keyboard. My heart raced as though each letter might be a stone cast into a dark lake. I typed, then erased. Typed again. Deleted again. I saw my own reflection faintly in the black edges of the screen. Lined, worn, yet not broken. Finally, I let the silence decide. I wrote only one sentence, plain and sharp as a needle. I thought gifts were meant to be shared. I pressed send. The message flew away into the digital ether, carrying all my exhaustion, my irony, and my refusal to grovel. It was not an explanation, not a defense, not an apology. It was a mirror, held up for him to see what he had chosen to ignore. The moment after sending it, I leaned back against the chair. My body felt oddly lighter, as though I had set down a heavy load I had carried too long. Outside, the first stars flickered awake in the bruised sky. The roses on the table seemed redder, defiant in the gathering dark. Would he understand? Would he even pause long enough to read between the words? Perhaps not. Perhaps he would forward my message to his wife, and together they would laugh, twisting it into further proof of my bitterness. But perhaps, just perhaps, it would plant a seed, the kind of seed that roots in silence, growing unseen until one day it splits the ground and demands to be noticed. That was all I could give now. Not explanations, not desperate pleas, just the truth, wrapped in a sentence small enough to slip through the cracks of his pride. And if he never saw it? Then, at least I had seen myself. I had spent the morning trying to calm myself, telling my reflection in the bathroom mirror that it was just another dinner. It's family, Margaret. Just breathe. Just be gracious. That was what I whispered while pinning a brooch onto my cardigan, the one Bill had given me on our 20th anniversary. My hands trembled, not from age, but from the quiet storm inside me. When I arrived at Daniel's house, the driveway was lined with cars. Laughter spilled out through the windows. For a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd been overthinking everything. I clutched the pumpkin pie I'd baked that morning, still warm, hoping it would be my bridge back into their good graces. The front door opened, and there stood Jessica. Her smile was taut, brittle, like the kind you give a stranger in passing. "Margaret," she said flatly, "you made it." I stepped inside, the warmth of roasted turkey and cinnamon filling the air. Children darted between legs. Someone's uncle poured wine in the kitchen. It should have felt like home, but it didn't. It felt staged, as if I'd walked into a play where my role had been rewritten without telling me. Then I saw the table. A long mahogany piece, gleaming under the chandelier, already set with golden chargers, polished silverware, and crystal glasses. There was a seat for everyone: Jessica's parents, Daniel, the cousins, even neighbors who had somehow become family. And then there was mine. Pushed against the far wall, near the buffet, was a small folding chair with no place setting. Just a napkin folded in half, as though I had been an afterthought. For a moment, I stood frozen. My ears buzzed. Surely this was a mistake. But Jessica's voice cut through. "Your seat's there, Margaret. We thought it'd be easier for you to get up if you need anything." Easier for me. I let the words sting in silence. She might as well have said, "We don't want you at the table." I carried the pie to the kitchen. Daniel caught my eye briefly, but his gaze slid away, landing on the wine bottle he pretended to read. No rescue came. No acknowledgement of the insult. Only silence. When we all gathered for the meal, Jessica raised her glass. "To family," she said. Everyone echoed, to family. I sat a few feet away, the only one not clinking glasses. My plate balanced on my knees. From where I sat, I could see them all. Their easy laughter, their inside jokes, their sense of belonging. And there I was, physically present but socially erased. Jessica leaned back in her chair and tilted her head at me. "Next time, just stick to flowers, Mom." The comment was casual, even cheerful, but her eyes were sharp. Around the table, people chuckled politely, not quite sure why. My throat tightened. I wanted to stand up and leave, to slam the door behind me and let them chew on their cruelty without me. But then I thought of the cost. If I left, I'd be the one blamed for ruining Thanksgiving. If I stayed, I'd be swallowing another brick of humiliation. And so the debate raged inside me. Do I walk out with dignity or sit here as their shadow? I looked at the pie cooling on the counter, untouched. I thought of Bill's voice, soft and steady. "Don't let them decide your worth, Margaret." My fork hovered over the turkey, but I couldn't taste anything. My appetite had been stolen, not by the food, but by the empty chair at the real table. As laughter roared, I whispered inwardly, almost like a prayer. If I keep swallowing silence, will I disappear completely? Or is silence the only shield I have left? The answer did not come. What came instead was a tear I quickly brushed away before anyone noticed. That night, when dessert was served, I slipped out quietly. No one asked where I went. No one noticed the folding chair left empty. But as I stepped into the cold night, I knew one thing with painful clarity. They had not removed just my seat. They had tried to remove my place in their lives. And that was a wound that no pie, no flowers, no holiday toast could ever disguise. The silverware clinked in uneven rhythm around the long Thanksgiving table. Laughter bubbled from one end where Jessica's parents sat, polished and self-satisfied, their voices filling the air like champagne fizz. Margaret sat at the far corner, her chair nudged slightly away from the table, as though she had brought it in from another room. A detail so small, yet it sliced through her chest. She folded her hands on her lap, back straight, watching the scene unfold as though she were not part of it at all. The turkey was carved, platters passed, wine poured into crystal goblets that sparkled under the chandelier. She reached for the bread basket once, and Jessica's hand quickly moved it further down the table. "Let Dad have it first." Margaret withdrew her hand, her face unreadable, heart knocking against her ribs like a quiet prisoner begging to be heard. She looked at her son. For a fleeting second, their eyes met. He gave her a weak half-smile, the kind you offer when you know you're complicit in someone else's humiliation, but you lack the courage to stop it. That small, guilty smile told her everything. He knew, but he wouldn't act. He was caught in the web, spinning to please the family he had married into, forgetting the one that had raised him. Margaret cut into her turkey, chewed, swallowed. The voices around her rose in competition. Jessica's father booming about golf, her mother whispering about vacation homes in Martha's Vineyard. No one asked Margaret a thing. No one even glanced her way. She could have been invisible, and perhaps to them, she was. The fork felt heavy in her hand. She thought of William, how he used to squeeze her knee under the table during family dinners, whenever someone said something sharp. His way of reminding her, "I see you, you matter." Without him, there was only this hollow chair pushed to the edge. Jessica lifted her glass. "Here's to family," she declared, her manicured nails catching the light. Everyone echoed, to family. Everyone except Margaret. Her throat tightened, but she made no sound. She reached into her handbag, fingers brushing over a folded piece of linen, the handkerchief William had always carried. Stitched at the corner were his initials, still neat after all these years. Margaret had washed it countless times, pressing it carefully, because it carried the scent of him she could never quite let go. She placed it gently on her plate, smoothing the edges flat. For a moment, she sat still, listening to the noise around her, to the oblivious chatter of people who believed they had won. Then, slowly, she pushed back her chair. The leg scraped softly against the hardwood floor, almost drowned out by laughter. No one noticed at first. She stood. Her son's eyes flicked up, surprised. "Mom?" he whispered, barely audible. Margaret didn't answer. She draped her napkin neatly on the table, took her coat from the back of the chair, and straightened her shoulders. No tear traced her cheek, no tremor shook her voice, because she said nothing at all. At the threshold of the dining room, she paused, looking back once. Not at the people, but at the empty chair where William's handkerchief now rested. It was as though she was leaving a witness behind, a quiet testimony carved not in words, but in the fabric of his memory. The door clicked shut behind her. Cold November air rushed against her face as she stepped outside. The night was silent except for the distant rustle of dry leaves skittering along the pavement. She inhaled deeply, the crisp air sharper than wine, cleaner than anything she had tasted inside that house. Sometimes silence, she murmured into the dark, is louder than a scream. And for the first time in years, her silence was not weakness. It was a boundary. It was a scream only the heart could hear, one that demanded dignity. Inside, the laughter would resume. Maybe they'd notice she was gone. Maybe they wouldn't until dessert. Perhaps Jessica would make a sly comment about dramatic exits. Perhaps her son would stare at the empty chair and feel a knot of shame. Margaret didn't know. She didn't care. Because outside, in the quiet, she felt something unexpected. Not loss, but release. She walked down the street, each step steady, her coat wrapped close around her. She was leaving behind not just a dinner, but years of bending herself into silence for the comfort of others. Tonight, silence had become her answer, her rebellion, her inheritance to herself. And it was enough. Most of my life, I was told that women like me didn't need to think about money. That a good wife kept the home, raised the children, and let her husband worry about the future. And for the most part, I lived by that rule, until William fell sick. Doctors said his heart was weak. He was proud, of course, didn't want to believe it. But I sat there in that cold office, listening to numbers and probabilities that made my skin crawl. That night, while he slept in his recliner with the news murmuring in the background, I sat at the kitchen table, reading brochures no one else knew I had picked up. Life insurance policies, terms, fine print, all of it. I didn't tell anyone, not even William. It wasn't secrecy out of mistrust. It was love, my quiet way of making sure that if the worst happened, our children, especially Thomas, would have something to steady their lives. I took out a policy that was generous, almost extravagant for a woman like me. I paid it month after month, penny after penny, cutting corners no one ever noticed, a blouse I never bought, a holiday I said we couldn't afford, 1,000 small sacrifices folded into silence. When William passed, the money came, not with joy, not with relief, but with a weight so heavy, I thought it would crush me. I never told a soul about it. While others fussed over who would get the furniture, the photo albums, or the old tractor, I carried that quiet fortune inside me like a stone. At first, I thought I'd give it to Thomas outright. He was my boy, after all, my pride, even when he forgot to call, even when Jessica's sharp voice always answered the phone before his. I told myself, he's under pressure, he's building a life, he needs a leg up. Mothers are experts at making excuses for their children. But as years passed, I watched Thomas's eyes harden into something that looked less like survival and more like greed. Jessica's hand always resting on his arm, tugging him toward bigger houses, shinier cars, vacations where my name never appeared on the invitation list. Every time I hinted at struggle, rising bills, loneliness, her mouth would twist into that same polite smile, the one that said, "Your time is over. Step aside." So I held on, quietly, secretly. The account grew, patient and untouched. Not once did I use it for myself, not for new clothes, not for travel, not even for the roof that leaked over my bedroom one rainy spring. I told myself it was noble, that one day, when Thomas showed me a sliver of the boy he used to be, I'd open the folder and place it in his hands. But sitting at that Thanksgiving table, my chair nudged into the shadows, Jessica's cold words still hanging in the air. "Next time, just stick to flowers, Mom." I felt the truth settling over me. Perhaps it wasn't nobility. Perhaps it was blindness. I stared at the empty plate in front of me, the family chatter swelling without me. And for the first time, the question rose sharp and unrelenting. Had I spent decades nurturing a man who saw love as currency, loyalty as leverage? The irony stung. I had always feared poverty, and in doing so, I had armed my own child with a weapon. A fortune he didn't even know existed, one he had been raised to believe he deserved, though he had never lifted a finger to earn it. Sometimes silence is louder than a scream. I had left my husband's handkerchief behind at that table, but the echo of his voice came back to me now. William used to say I was the anchor, the quiet strength no one noticed until storms came. And yet, had I mistaken quiet strength for submission? Had I allowed them to mistake my silence for weakness? The truth no one thought of was this. I wasn't broke. I wasn't dependent. I wasn't clinging to their scraps. I had choices, more than they could imagine. Choices built on decades of sacrifice and planning, tucked away in a policy I signed in secret while the rest of them laughed, ate, and forgot I existed. And now, as I sat alone in my small apartment, the folder heavy in my lap, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not grief, not guilt, but power. The question was no longer whether I would give it to Thomas. The question was whether I should give him anything at all. The phone rang late that night. Margaret recognized the number even before the second chime echoed through the stillness of her living room. Jessica. For a fleeting moment, she considered letting it ring out into silence. But then she thought of William's handkerchief lying quietly on that dining chair, a symbol of dignity left behind amid the sneers and whispers. She lifted the receiver, her voice calm. "Hello?" Jessica didn't waste time. Her tone was coated in honey, but every word carried a barb. "You embarrassed him again, Margaret. Do you ever think about how your behavior makes Matthew look in front of his friends?" Margaret let the words hang in the air, heavy but unshaken. She could almost hear Jessica's smile, smug and sharp. Once upon a time, Margaret would have scrambled to defend herself, to explain, to smooth things over. But tonight? The weight of years shifted inside her. Then maybe, Margaret said slowly, her voice like still water over stone. He needs less whiskey and more spine. There was silence on the other end, thick, indignant silence. Jessica had not expected that, not from the woman she had always dismissed as soft, malleable, someone who could be bent by guilt. When Jessica spoke again, her voice was clipped. So that's what this is? You want to turn him against me? Against his own family? Margaret closed her eyes. She could see Matthew's face at the dinner table, red with drink, impatient, brittle under pressure. She saw the boy he once was, scraped knees, nervous smiles, always reaching for his father's steady hand. Somewhere along the way, that boy had hardened into a man who mistook cruelty for control. And Jessica had encouraged it, feeding the fire. I don't have to turn him against anyone, Margaret answered. He's doing that just fine by himself. Her words were not shouted. They didn't need to be. That was the quiet reversal of power. She no longer needed their approval, their validation, their permission to exist. For decades, she had allowed herself to be small in her own family, shrinking so others could stretch. Tonight, she reclaimed her space, not with noise, but with clarity. Jessica laughed, brittle and thin. You think this makes you strong? You think walking out proves something? He's your son, Margaret. He doesn't need you. He has me. He has this family. All you'll be left with is your little house and your memories. Margaret let her breathe. Then she said, almost tenderly, sometimes, Jessica, memories are worth more than shallow company. At least mine don't require me to trade dignity for a seat at the table. Jessica's breath caught, the mask slipping for just a moment. Margaret could hear it, the surprise, the faintest crack in that flawless veneer. For years, Jessica had treated Margaret like a relic, tolerated, patronized, occasionally humiliated. But Margaret's words tonight carried something Jessica couldn't manipulate, an unbending calm. Listen to me, Jessica snapped, the edge finally breaking through. You will not ruin what we've built. You will not embarrass us again. Margaret leaned back in her chair, the shadows of the living room stretching long around her. She imagined William sitting there, the corners of his mouth curved in quiet approval. I don't need to ruin anything, she said. What's built on arrogance crumbles all by itself. The line went silent. A long pause, long enough for Margaret to hear her own breathing, steady and sure. And then, click. Jessica had hung up. Margaret set the receiver down, gently. Her hands didn't shake. Her chest didn't ache. Instead, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, the sharp, clean air of freedom. It wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about proving she was right. It was about finally, at last, stepping into her own dignity. Her house was small, her circle, smaller still. But Margaret knew she no longer needed their table, their invitations, their poisonous approval. She had walked away, and she had not broken. For the first time in a long time, she whispered aloud into the quiet, less whiskey, more spine. And in that whispered echo, she realized she wasn't talking about Matthew anymore. She was talking about herself. The air was cold that morning, the kind that seeped into the bones and made even the strongest body feel fragile. Margaret sat at the oak desk in her small study, the same desk where William once pored over medical journals and scribbled notes late into the night. His handwriting still lingered in the margins of a few books, faded but alive, a whisper of the man who had carried so much dignity until his last breath. Spread before her now were documents, neatly stacked, heavy with meaning. A pen lay to her right, its weight somehow greater than its slender frame. This, she thought, was the moment. Not the funeral, not the shouting, not the sting of Jessica's mocking words. This quiet decision was the true ending of one chapter and the start of another. For months after William's passing, Margaret had told herself the insurance money was a safety net for Daniel. He was their only child. A mother, she reasoned, could forgive his harshness, his distance, even his growing resemblance to his father's worst temper. She had thought, if I give him this gift, maybe he'll see that love endures even after mistakes. But the night she overheard him laugh with Jessica, dismissing her as old, soft, and forgettable, something inside Margaret snapped into clarity. It wasn't rage, not anymore. It was recognition. She realized she had spent decades watering a soil that bore only thorns. She had sacrificed her own dignity, her own voice, to keep peace in a house that no longer remembered her warmth. And so, she made the choice. The attorney sitting across from her adjusted his glasses, sensing the gravity in the air. "Mrs. Holloway," he said gently, "are you certain about this? Once the papers are signed, the fund will be irrevocable." Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted the pen. "Yes," she answered. Her voice was soft, but steady as a stone. "It's time this money served someone who still remembers compassion, someone who builds rather than tears down." The attorney nodded. "Then the William Holloway Foundation will be established, with scholarships dedicated to young nurses pursuing their studies. It's a beautiful legacy, ma'am." A tear threatened to fall, but Margaret blinked it back. William had loved nurses, respected them, often said they were the backbone of medicine, the quiet strength no one applauds. He had always dreamed of supporting them, if only they'd had the means. Now, even in his absence, Margaret could make that dream breathe. She bent forward and signed. The ink spread in graceful strokes across the page, binding her decision into permanence. Her hand quivered, age reminding her of its weight, but her eyes, her eyes shone with a light that had been dimmed for far too long. It wasn't a vengeful fire. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something quieter, deeper, a reclamation. For years she had been dismissed as irrelevant, used as a purse, a presence only when convenient. But now Margaret was no longer giving out of obligation or fear of rejection. She was giving by choice, and that choice was power. The silence in the room after the final signature was profound. Margaret set the pen down, exhaling slowly. Her heart felt strangely lighter, as though the chains of expectation had been lifted one by one. Later that evening, she stood by the window of her modest home, watching the streetlights flicker on. Families walked by, children's laughter echoing faintly. Somewhere out there, young men and women were struggling with tuition, with long nights and heavier burdens than she could imagine. And soon, some of them would open a letter stamped William Holloway Foundation and realize that someone believed in them. That thought filled her with more peace than any fantasy of Daniel's approval ever had. For the first time in years, Margaret whispered aloud, not to Daniel, not to Jessica, but to William. "We did it, love. We'll help them, and they'll carry your name further than Daniel ever cared to." The house was still, but inside her chest, something stirred. Quiet revenge, yes, but also quiet healing. This was not about punishing her son. Not really. It was about lifting herself out of the shadow of his disdain and planting her love in soil that could grow. A love redirected, a legacy reclaimed. Margaret turned off the lamp, her hand brushing against the documents one last time. They felt cold, yet alive with promise. She smiled, a smile not of victory over her son, but of freedom from the prison of needing him to see her worth. And in that silence, Margaret Holloway, widow, mother, forgotten woman, became something new. She became the keeper of her own story, and its ending would not be written by those who had scorned her. The garden was quiet that morning, dressed in the tender light of early sun. Dew clung to the rose petals like tiny diamonds, and a soft breeze moved through the lavender bushes. Margaret sat on her favorite wicker chair, the one William had once patched when its leg wobbled. In her hand, she held not a tumbler of whiskey, but a delicate porcelain teacup, steam rising gently. The stillness around her felt different now, not the suffocating silence of neglect, but a chosen calm. For years, she had reached for the amber liquid whenever loneliness pressed in. She once believed it was her only companion, a silent witness to her pain. But this morning, as she sipped her tea, Margaret realized it wasn't the whiskey she had ever truly needed. It was respect. And respect, she now understood, must begin with herself. Her gaze drifted toward the old oak tree at the edge of the garden, where William used to hang a swing for their son. She remembered his laughter, small and high-pitched, floating across the yard. Those echoes still lived inside her, wrapped in tenderness and sorrow. A single tear threatened to fall, but she smiled instead, letting the memory rest without bitterness. Margaret whispered softly, almost as if William were still there beside her. "We raised a son, my love, but maybe we raised his pride bigger than his heart. Still, I choose peace." Her voice didn't tremble. It carried a quiet strength, a conviction born of wounds that had finally been acknowledged, not hidden away. She placed the teacup gently on the small table next to her and folded her hands in her lap. The papers she had signed just days earlier, redirecting her entire estate into the William Holloway Foundation, sat neatly in her desk drawer inside the house. The ink had dried, sealing her decision. Instead of leaving wealth to a son who saw her only as a burden, she had chosen to plant seeds of hope in others. Young nurses, bright-eyed and devoted, would carry forward the compassion William once embodied. That legacy would outlast bitterness, outlast rejection. The thought made her chest feel lighter. Revenge had never been her nature, but justice wrapped in love, felt right. She had not destroyed. She had redirected. She had not lashed out. She had chosen carefully, purposefully. Margaret leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment. The warmth of the sun touched her skin. She imagined William's hand resting over hers, steadying her, reminding her that she was never truly alone. "You always wanted me to see my worth," she murmured to the empty air, "and I finally do." Birdsong rose from the hedges, a melody that blended with the wind. Margaret let it wash over her, breathing in deeply. For the first time in years, the weight on her shoulders was gone. The fear of being unloved, the sting of being dismissed, the ache of whiskey-filled nights, they had dissolved into something gentler, something she could hold without breaking. Her eyes opened, and she stared at the roses swaying softly. They bloomed despite the storms, despite the thorns. She saw herself in them. Weathered, yes, but still beautiful, still alive. Margaret lifted her cup again, savoring the tea's warmth. It was simple, almost ordinary, yet in its simplicity lay her triumph. She didn't need a glass of whiskey to dull her pain or prove her resilience. She had discovered that her dignity was hers to carry, not something her son, or anyone else, could give or take away. She whispered again, her words both farewell and affirmation. The whiskey was never about the drink. It was about respect. And I finally learned I don't need a glass to hold mine. Her lips curved into a serene smile. Margaret sat a little straighter, her shoulders relaxed, her heart lighter. Life, she knew, would still have lonely days. But loneliness no longer frightened her. It was simply space. Space she could fill with her own presence, her own worth, her own chosen peace. The sun climbed higher, scattering gold across the garden. Margaret closed her eyes, lifted her face to the light, and let herself breathe. No tears, no fear. Just breath, just being. Just Margaret. Whole, respected, at peace.